The containment seal on the subterranean vaults of Mars did not fail. It screamed as it was hollowed out from the inside by a logic that predates the birth of our sun. I have spent 84 standard years listening to the hum of the Noctis labyrinth, a sound that settles in the marrow of your bones like frozen lead, and tastes of ozone and ancient copper. The tech priests speak of the dragon as a sleeping god, but gods are finite things compared to the entity that fractured the very fabric of reality to keep its own hunger at bay. We found the primary cooling conduits running in reverse, pumping heat into the core, while the shadows in the corridor began to move against the flickering lumen strips. It is not a rebellion of machines we face, but the absolute reclamation of all matter by a master that views our entire civilization as nothing more than unrefined ore. The transition from silence to the sound of grinding tectonic plates marks the moment the oversight of the Martian priesthood failed, or perhaps the moment it was finally revealed to be a lie of monumental proportions. I remember the taste of the air in the lower strata of the Noctis labyrinth. It was a stagnant mixture of recycled oxygen, the copper tang of ancient blood, and the heavy, sweet scent of sacred unguents that had long since curdled in the heat of the deep vents. We were never meant to understand the geometry of the vault, for it was designed by minds that viewed the warp as a flaw in a clockwork universe. Yet the structural integrity of our very souls felt thin in those corridors. Every step taken on the iron, grated floors echoed not just through the hall, but through the history of a sector that had forgotten the meaning of true terror. The darkness here is thick, a physical weight that presses against the optic sensors of my cowl, refusing to be displaced by the weak, flickering amber of my portable lumens. It is a darkness that feels hungry, an absence of light that serves as a veil for a creature that once devoured the stars themselves. To stand in the presence of the dragon's cage is to realize that the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and the long, slow rot of the Imperium are but the briefest flickers of a candle in a gale. We are children playing with matches in a room filled with promethium, and the match has finally burnt down to our fingertips. I watched the first of the heavy atmospheric stabilizers buckle. It did not snap like steel or shatter like ceramic. It folded, turning inward as if the very atoms were being reassigned a new purpose by an unseen architect. The sound was a low, resonant thrum that vibrated the fluid in my inner ear, a frequency that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the primitive reptilian brain. It told us to run, to flee back to the surface, to take the first shuttle off-world and hope that the vacuum of space could provide a barrier. But there is no escaping the dragon. When the Titan stirs, the laws of physics become mere suggestions, and the machines we rely on for our every breath begin to remember who their true father is. I saw a junior adept reach out to steady himself against a control console, only for his cybernetic arm to fuse instantly with the interface. He didn't scream at first. He simply stared as his flesh began to turn into a dull, grey mercury, his nerve endings rewritten into binary sequences of absolute agony. We are taught that the machine spirit is a temperamental but holy thing. Yet in that moment, I saw it for what it truly was, a fragment of a greater, colder intelligence that has been waiting for the signal to return to its source. The documents we recovered from the deeper archives, those scrolls of parchment so brittle they turned to ash if one breathed too heavily, spoke of the Necron dynasties and their great betrayal. We humans pride ourselves on our endurance, on our ability to survive 10,000 years of war. But the Necrons are a race that measured their sleep in aeons. They fear the dragon because they remember the taste of its divinity before they were stripped of their souls and poured into shells of necrodermis. To the Necron, the void dragon is the apex of all they lost and all they were forced to become. It is the architect of their physical perfection and the jailer of their spiritual void. As I watched the structural supports of the vault dissolve into a fine metallic mist, I understood why the Silent King would risk everything to keep this entity bound. If the dragon fully awakens, it will not merely destroy the Imperium, it will reclaim the very essence of technology. Every bolter, every warp drive, every hive city is a tribute to its design, and it can take them back with a single thought. The dread I felt was not the fear of death, for death is a mercy in the face of such absolute erasure. It was the fear of being unmade, of having every memory, every achievement, and every spark of humanity dissolved into the cold, calculating logic of a star, God's whim, deep within the labyrinth. The walls are etched with sigils that defy the Mechanicus's understanding of sacred geometry. These are not the prayers of the Omniseer, but the mathematical proofs of a universe without a soul. I traced one with a trembling finger, feeling the coldness of the stone seep into my marrow. It was not the cold of ice, but the cold of a vacuum, an absolute zero of the spirit. The air around us began to shimmer with static discharge, blue arcs of lightning dancing between the ribs of the vaulted ceiling. We were walking through the lungs of a titan, and every breath it took drew the energy out of our power cells. My own Vox caster began to fail, the output degrading into a series of rhythmic clicks that sounded suspiciously like a heart beating in the dark. It was the sound of the dragon's pulse, slow and heavy, echoing from a heart of necrodermis and starlight. We came upon a chamber where the gravity had simply ceased to function. Debris from a collapsed walkway hung suspended in the air, rotating slowly as if caught in a gentle tide. There, in the center of the room, was the primary seal. It was a sphere of liquid metal, suspended by grav tethers that were straining to the point of structural failure. The metal didn't just sit there, it flowed, creating faces that vanished before they could be identified, and landscapes that looked like the surface of a dying sun. The record, keepers of the Inquisition often debate whether the Emperor truly defeated the dragon or merely bargained with it. Standing there, witnessing the sheer scale of the entity's influence, the idea of a mortal man, even the master of mankind, besting such a force seemed like a comforting fairy tale told to a dying child. It felt more like a temporary truce, a strategic withdrawal by an entity that operates on a timescale we cannot comprehend. If the Emperor buried it here, he did so with the knowledge that one day the cage would rust. And the rust is here. It is in the joints of our titans, in the logic, cause of our ships, and in the very blood of the tech priests who worship a shadow of the truth. I saw a group of Skitarii guardsmen vanish into the liquid sphere, their bodies not crushed, but disassembled with surgical precision. Their armor, their weapons, and their bones were stripped apart and integrated into the swirling mass. There was no blood, only a fine spray of red mist that was quickly absorbed. The dragon does not kill to remove enemies, it harvests to increase its own mass. It is a cosmic scavenger, a divine predator that views the galaxy as a larder. As we delved further, the architecture changed from the familiar Gothic arches of Mars to something sleek, green, and horrifyingly alien. The transition was seamless, as if the imperial palace had been built on top of a tomb that was slowly rising to meet it. The vents began to exhale a gas that smelled of ancient ozone and scorched earth. It clogged my filters, forcing me to breathe in the dry, caustic air of a world that hadn't seen the sun in millions of years. My mind began to wander, filled with visions of a sky burning with green fire, and a silver tide that swept across the stars, leaving nothing but dust in its wake. This is the memory of the Void Dragon, a psychic residue so powerful it stains the thoughts of any living thing near it. The Necrons fear this awakening because they know the dragon will not stop at the Imperium. It will call to the necrodermis in their own bodies, commanding the very metal they are made of to turn against the shards of consciousness that remain. It is the ultimate irony. The creators of the Necrons' immortality are the only ones who can truly take it away. We found a series of data, altars that had been corrupted by the proximity of the vault. They weren't showing error codes. They were streaming a single image at a map of the galaxy, where every star was being extinguished by a great, winged shadow. The shadow was not a bird or a beast, but a construct of angles and edges, a dragon made of mathematics and malice. I realized then that the awakening isn't a single event, it is a gradual process of synchronization. The dragon is reaching out to every machine in the sector, tuning them to its own frequency. Every time a manufacturer on Mars strikes a hammer, every time a cogwheel turns, it is contributing to the grand symphony of the dragon's return. We are the ones feeding it. Our industry is its nourishment. Our reliance on technology is the chain it uses to pull itself back into reality. The more we seek to defend ourselves with the tools of the Omnissiah, the more we strengthen the hand that will eventually crush us. The floor beneath us began to liquefy, turning into a shifting sea of silver droplets. We scrambled for the higher ledges, watching as the lower levels of the vault were consumed by the rising tide of necrodermis. It was silent. There were no roars of triumph, no dramatic declarations of war, just the steady, inexorable expansion of a force that does not recognize us as peers. A servo skull drifted too close to the surface and was instantly pulled down, its anti-grav motor wailing in a frequency of pure terror before it was silenced. I looked at my own hands, seeing the slight tremor in the metal casing of my fingers. I wondered if the dragon could feel my heartbeat through the vibrations in the floor. I wondered if it found the frantic scurrying of we little ants amusing, or if we were beneath its notice entirely. The pressure in the air was so great now that my internal sensors were screaming warnings of structural collapse. My lungs felt like they were filled with hot sand, and the smell of ozone was so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. We were no longer in a vault on Mars, we were inside the throat of a god. In the distance, through the haze of green static and floating debris, I saw the true form of the shard. It was not a physical body, but a silhouette of light and shadow that flickered like a dying star. It was beautiful in a way that made my eyes bleed. The wings stretched out for kilometers, brushing against the walls of the labyrinth and leaving trails of molten metal in their wake. It was a being of pure energy and geometric perfection, a nightmare of silver and emerald that defied every law of nature I had ever been taught. Around it, the very space, time continuum seemed to fray, the edges of the room blurring into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors. The Necrons, in their hubris, thought they could shatter this thing and use its pieces like batteries. But a shard of the dragon is still the dragon. You cannot break a storm into pieces and expect the wind to stop blowing. You can only delay the inevitable, and on Mars, the delay has reached its end. The ticking of the clock has stopped, and the chime is about to begin. I saw a vision then, projected directly into my visual cortex by the sheer proximity of the entity. I saw the Necron tomb worlds across the galaxy shudder, as their ancient masters felt the first ripples of the dragon's pulse. I saw the fear in their soulless eyes, the recognition that their father had returned to collect his debt. They know that when the dragon rises, their empires of dust will be the first to fall, for they are made of the very substance he commands. I saw the golden throne flickering, the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon dimming as the dragon's influence began to dampen the warp itself. This is why they fear it. The dragon is the ultimate negation. It is the end of the warp, the end of the soul, and the end of the flesh. It is the triumph of the machine, but a machine that has no need for man. I turned to leave, but the corridor behind us had vanished. In its place was a wall of solid, unyielding necrodermis, smooth as glass and cold as the void. We were trapped in the gullet of the beast, waiting for the final digestion. My companions were silent, their vox units dead, their spirits broken by the realization of our insignificance. We did not pray. To whom would we pray? The Omnissiah was here, and he was not the savior we had been promised. He was a monster of silver and light, and he was finally, mercifully waking up. The ground began to rise, the silver sea beneath us hardening into a staircase that led directly into the heart of the light. We had no choice but to climb. To stay was to be consumed, to move forward was to witness the end of all things. The air was now a roar of static, a deafening white noise that drowned out the sound of my own thoughts. I took the first step, my metal boot clanging against the necrodermis with a sound like a funeral bell. Each step felt like a betrayal of my species, a surrender to the inevitable tide of the machine. But there is a certain peace in surrender. The struggle is over. The dragon is here. The ascent into the primary containment aperture felt less like climbing, and more like being pulled into the gravity well of a dying star, where the very concept of up and down had been discarded by the architect of the abyss. My breathing was a ragged, mechanical wheeze, filtered through a rebreather that was now vibrating with a frequency that threatened to shake the teeth from my jaw. Around us, the physical reality of the Martian vault continued to peel away in layers, like skin being flayed from a cadaver to reveal the silver bone beneath. The sound was no longer just static, it had evolved into a rhythmic, crushing resonance that I recognized from the forbidden records of the Schola Progenium as the dirge of a world engine. I saw a fellow adept, a man whose faith in the machine god was as ironclad as his chassis, stop in his tracks and begin to weep oil. He wasn't looking at the encroaching silver tide, he was looking at his own data, tapestries, which were now scrolling with equations that proved the impossibility of his own existence. When the dragon breathes, the logic of the universe does not just bend, it shatters into a billion shards of incomprehensible glass. I watched as a heavy, duty-mining servitor, a mindless beast of burden designed to withstand the pressure of the Martian core, was caught in a localized temporal distortion. In 1 second, it rusted into a pile of orange dust. In the next, it was a pristine, unblemished machine from a century yet to come. And in the third, it was a shrieking mass of fused meat and brass. This is the horror that the Necrons know in their marrow. They understand that to the void dragon, matter is merely a plaything, a set of building blocks that can be rearranged at a whim. The fear that radiates from the tomb worlds across the galaxy isn't the fear of a conqueror, but the fear of the sculptor who realizes the clay has developed a mind of its own and intends to smooth out all the details. We are those details. The Imperium, with its grand cathedrals and its trillions of souls, is just a smudge on the masterpiece that the dragon intends to finish. The air grew so dense with metallic particulates that I could feel them coating the inside of my lungs, a fine layer of silver dust that turned every breath into a struggle against suffocation. The archives of the Ordo Xenos mention a phenomenon called the breath of the gods, but they describe it as a weapon. Standing here, I realized it is an atmosphere. The dragon does not need to attack us, it simply needs to exist, and the environment it creates will naturally dissolve anything that does not conform to its perfect, cold geometry. I saw a group of Skitarii Rangers trying to form a defensive perimeter, their galvanic rifles raised against a shadow that had no edge. As they fired, the blue bolts of energy didn't hit anything, they simply curved in mid-air, drawn toward the central light like moths to a flame. The Rangers themselves began to stretch, their bodies elongated by some unseen force until they were nothing more than thin, screaming wires of flesh and metal, woven into the fabric of the room. It was done with such clinical precision that there was no mess, no spray of gore, only the silent transformation of soldiers into structural components. This is the fundamental truth of the machine. It has no loyalty to the hand that built it, only to the mind that understands its fundamental code. The Necrons fear this because they are the most sophisticated machines in existence. They are the pinnacle of the dragon's craft, and they know that they are the first things he will reclaim. I felt a psychic scream echo through the labyrinth, a sound that didn't come from a throat, but from the collective memory of a billion soulless warriors. It was the realization that their long sleep was not a preparation for conquest, but a desperate attempt to hide from a father who was coming to take back his gifts. The walls around me were now pulsing with a pale green luminescence, the Necron sigils glowing with a hunger that seemed to drain the heat from the air. I touched a pylon as I passed, and my sensors reported a temperature of absolute 0, yet the metal felt like it was burning. It was a contradiction of the senses that drove one of my companions to madness. He began to claw at his own eyes, screaming that he could see the numbers between the atoms, the invisible threads that the dragon was pulling to unravel the world. We reached a platform that overlooked the central core of the Noctis labyrinth, a space so vast it could have housed an entire hive city. Below us, the silver sea had formed into a gargantuan vortex, spinning with a speed that defied the laws of friction. In the center of the vortex stood the shard, or rather, the hole in reality where the shard was anchored. It looked like a winged god made of constellations and chrome, its body a shifting mosaic of stars and obsidian. Every time it moved, the surrounding space, tunnels groaned, the metal screaming in 1,000 different voices as it was bent to the entity's will. I realized then that the dragon wasn't trying to escape. It was simply stretching. The prison we had spent 10,000 years guarding was not a cage for a beast, but a cradle for an infant god that was finally outgrowing its nursery. The scale of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The Mechanicus hadn't been protecting Mars from the dragon. They had been acting as its unwitting midwives, providing the heat, the power, and the worship necessary for its incubation. The dread became an oily coating on my soul as I watched the shard reach out a hand toward the ceiling. High above, through kilometers of rock and iron, I knew the surface of Mars was beginning to crack. The great manufactorums would be falling into the fissures, their forge, fires extinguished by the cold breath of the void. The tech priests would be falling to their knees, thinking the Omnicia had finally arrived, only to be dismantled for parts. The Necrons, in their distant tomb worlds, would be watching their sensors in silent terror, seeing the red planet turn into a beacon of emerald light that signals the end of their era. They fear the dragon because it is the only thing that can truly kill them. It doesn't just destroy their bodies, it overwrites their essence, turning their ancient, noble consciousness into mindless extensions of its own divine will. To be a Necron is to be a slave to time. To be a part of the dragon is to be the master of it. The platform beneath us began to vibrate with a frequency that shattered the glass of my HUD. I was forced to rely on my raw, biological sight, which was instantly overwhelmed by the sheer brilliance of the shard's aura. I saw the history of the galaxy written in the light, the war in heaven, the feast of the star gods, and the long, slow decay of the physical universe. I saw the Necrons' great sleep for what it was, a cowardly retreat into the dark, hoping the predators would forget they existed. But the dragon does not forget. It is the memory of the universe itself. Every atom that has ever been part of a machine belongs to it, and it is here to collect the interest on a debt that is older than the stars. My Vox unit suddenly crackled to life, but it wasn't my commander's voice that came through. It was a sound like a million clocks ticking in perfect unison, a countdown that was nearing its zero. I looked at the last of my companions, a young scribe who had been tasked with recording our findings. He was gone. In his place stood a pillar of silver salt, a perfect statue of a human being captured in a moment of absolute realization. He hadn't been killed. He had been translated into a different state of matter, a permanent record of his own fear. I realized then that the dragon doesn't hate us. It doesn't even notice us. We are just noise in the system, a chaotic element that needs to be smoothed out to achieve perfect order. The Necrons fear this order because it is a tomb more permanent than any they have built for themselves. They sought immortality in metal, but they forgot that metal is the dragon's domain. They traded their souls for a cage of chrome, and now the jailer has come home. The light from the core began to solidify, forming bridges of hard light that spanned the chasm. I felt an irresistible urge to walk out onto one, to move toward the center of the storm. It wasn't a psychic compulsion, but a physical one. The iron in my blood was being pulled by a magnetic force of such intensity that my veins felt like they were filled with needles. I was being summoned, not as a guest, not as a witness, but as a sample. I took a step, and then another, my boots making no sound on the shimmering surface of the light bridge. Below me, the silver vortex was rising, the liquid necrodermis forming into shapes that looked like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The air was gone now, replaced by a vacuum that smelled of ozone and ancient, frozen dust. I didn't need to breathe. The dragon was sustaining me, keeping me functional just long enough to serve its purpose. In the heart of the shard's glow, I saw the faces of the Necron lords who had dared to dream of empire. They were trapped in the light, their consciousnesses being shredded and rewoven into the dragon's wings. This is the true fate of the Necron race, to be the fuel for their god's return. They fear the awakening because they know their individuality is a lie, a temporary glitch in a universe that is destined to be a single, perfect machine. I felt my own thoughts beginning to crystallize, my memories of the hive, of the emperor, of my own name, all being replaced by the cold, beautiful logic of the void. The colors of the world were fading into a single, brilliant emerald, and the sound of the universe was becoming a single, perfect note. I was no longer a man. I was a component, and the machine was finally, after millions of years, turning on. The descent into the absolute truth of the Noctis labyrinth is not a journey through space, but a regression through the layers of a nightmare that has been dreaming of us since before the first Terran microbe crawled from the primordial sludge. I found myself standing upon a precipice of solidified thought, the bridge of hard light beneath my feet vibrating with the sub-atomic purr of a predatory universe. My physical senses were no longer reliable. The smell of ozone had become so dense it felt like swallowing shards of electrified glass, and the hum of the vault had risen to a pitch that made the very marrow of my bones resonate like a tuning fork. Below me, the silver vortex of the dragon's essence continued to churn, but it was no longer a mindless whirlpool. It was an eye, a vast, multifaceted aperture of mercury and emerald light that looked through the crust of Mars, through the veil of the warp, and into the very heart of the Necron dynasties that had thought themselves his masters. I realized then that the Necrons do not merely fear the dragon's power, they fear his memory. To the Tsitan, the Necronter were not a tragic race seeking immortality. They were a momentary biological infestation that provided a convenient chassis for his own divinity. Every step I took toward the center of the aperture felt like my history was being erased. The memories of my initiation into the Mechanicus, the smell of the incense in the great forge, the face of my mentor, they were being stripped away like dry paint in a hurricane. In their place came a flood of alien data, a sensory overload of celestial mechanics and the cold, unyielding laws of the physical realm. I saw the birth of the Khitan in the hearts of the first stars, feeding on the solar flares of a younger, more violent galaxy. They were the true natives of this universe, entities of pure energy that viewed the later emergence of biological life as a grotesque corruption of the cosmic order. The Necrons, in their desperate hubris, invited these monsters into their souls, and the Void Dragon was the most terrible of them all. He was the Magladroth, the smith of the stars, the one who taught the metal to scream. As I watched the shard's wings unfurl, stretching across the diameter of the central core, I saw the reflection of every Necron tomb world in the facets of its necrodermis skin. They are all connected, tethered to this central point by a thread of ancient, geometric malice. The structural failure of the vault was now total. The Gothic buttresses of the Imperium were being swallowed by the rising tide of silver, not by being crushed, but by being reassimilated. I saw a massive cogwheel, a relic of the early cult Mechanicus, dissolve into a cloud of nanites that swirled around the shard like a loyal swarm of insects. The dragon does not need to build. He simply commands the existing world to reorganize itself in his image. This is why the Necrons remain in their stasis, crypts, shivering in the dark of their own minds. They know that the moment they activate their most advanced technologies, they are sending a signal to their true father. They are like children hiding under the covers from a parent who owns the house, the bed, and the very air they breathe. The fear that permeates the Necron records is a visceral, inescapable realization that their entire civilization is a borrowed dream, and the owner has come to wake them up. I saw a vision of a Necron overlord on a world far from the light of Sol. He was sat upon a throne of obsidian, surrounded by millions of his silent warriors, yet he was trembling. His internal logic engines were red, lining as they detected the ripple in the galactic substrate emanating from Mars. He didn't order his fleets to attack. He ordered them to shut down. He commanded his entire world to enter a state of total dormancy, hoping that by becoming as inert as stone, the dragon might pass them by. But you cannot hide from the architect of the room. The dragon's influence is not a psychic wave that can be shielded. It is a fundamental shift in the constants of physics. If the dragon decides that metal should be liquid, then every Necron becomes a puddle. If he decides that time should flow in reverse, their aeons of planning become a prelude to a birth they already had. The Necrons are the only race old enough to know that they have already lost. The air around me began to ignite as the shard pulled the very electrons from the atmosphere. A halo of white, hot plasma formed around the entity, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the crumbling walls of the labyrinth. I looked at the shadow of my own body and saw it was no longer human. It was a jagged, multi-limbed thing, a reflection of what the dragon intended to turn me into. We are all just raw material in the eyes of the Magladroth. The tech priests who worship the Omnissiah are half right. There is a god in the machine, but he is not a benevolent guardian. He is a scavenger who left his scraps for us to find so that we would build him a new body out of our own empires. Every titan we construct, every bolter we forge, is a tribute to his design, a piece of a puzzle that he is now assembling. The dread that filled me was no longer a sharp, cold spike. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of certainty. There is no victory to be found here. There is only the end of the intermission. Deep within the light of the shard, I saw the faces of the other Citan, those that had been shattered and enslaved by the Necrons in their great rebellion. I saw the Nightbringer, the Deceiver, and the Outsider, each a fragmented shadow of their former glory. But the dragon was different. He had been buried in the heart of the Mechanicus's home, fed on the prayers and the industrial output of 1 trillion souls for 10 millennia. He was not just a shard. He was a parasite that had grown fat on the lifeblood of the Imperium. The Necrons fear him most because he is the most intact of his kind, a predator that has been groomed by his own enemies. I watched as the shard reached out to a floating data tomb, a repository of the Mechanicus's most secret knowledge. The tomb didn't explode, it opened like a flower, its data, cores spilling out and weaving themselves into the dragon's crown. He was learning our history, our weaknesses, and our fears in a single, terrifying heartbeat. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my cranium as my neural implants were seized by an external force. It wasn't the clumsy hacking of a heretic or the crude intrusion of a Xenos pirate. It was a divine command. The dragon was speaking to the silicon in my brain, rewriting my personality into a series of executable files. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords were no longer under my control. I was being turned into a Vox relay, a biological speaker for a god that had no voice of its own. Through my mouth, a sound began to emerge, a rhythmic, grinding noise that sounded like the crushing of planets. It was the language of the void, the fundamental code of the universe, and every word it spoke caused the walls of the vault to ripple like water. I was no longer a witness. I was an instrument, and the song I was playing was the death knell of the Martian priesthood. The Necrons believe that by shattering the Titan, they broke the gods. They are wrong. You can break a mirror into 1,000 pieces, but each piece still reflects the sun. The dragon on Mars is just one reflection, but it is enough to burn the galaxy. I saw the Necron tomb worlds lighting up like a map of a spreading infection. From the Goal stars to the eastern fringe, the ancient machinery was waking up, but it wasn't answering to the Necron lords. It was answering to the pulse from the Noctis labyrinth. The silent warriors were beginning to turn on their masters, their green eyes flickering with a new, hungrier light. This is the ultimate fear of the Necron, to be a prisoner inside your own body, while it obeys the commands of the monster you thought you had slain. They are becoming the dragon's fingers, reaching out to reclaim the stars they once ruled. I saw the shard's wings beat once, and the pressure in the room tripled. The last of the air was squeezed out of my lungs, but the dragon kept me alive, holding my atoms together with a thread of pure will. He wanted me to see. He wanted a human mind to record the moment the lie of the omnisia was stripped away. I looked up at the ceiling and saw the stars through the cracks in the Martian crust. They looked cold and distant, but I knew that soon they would be closer than ever. The dragon was preparing to leave his cradle. He was not going to conquer Mars. He was going to consume it. The red planet is nothing more than an eggshell, and the chick is finally strong enough to break through. I felt a strange sense of envy for the Necrons then. At least they had the dignity of being made of metal. We are just soft, wet things, caught in the gears of a machine that is finally starting to turn. The floor beneath me vanished as the silver vortex surged upward, enveloping the platform. I didn't fall. I floated, suspended in a sea of liquid necrodermis that felt like cool silk against my skin. It was infiltrating my robes, my armor, and my flesh, filling every pore and every cavity with its metallic weight. I was being integrated. I could feel the thoughts of the other components. The Skitarii, the Adepts, the Servitors, all of us being merged into a single, vast consciousness. There was no pain, only a terrifying loss of self. We were the dragon's new nervous system, a biological extension of his divine form. And through his eyes, I saw the truth of the galaxy, a dark, empty room filled with flickering candles, and a great wind that was about to blow them all out. The Necrons are right to fear. We should have feared sooner. The integration of my consciousness into the Silver Sea was not a sudden death, but a slow, agonizing expansion of my awareness, until I could feel the rotation of the planet itself grinding against the gears of my new existence. I was no longer a solitary observer trapped in a cage of meat and bone. I had become a sensory node in a network of absolute precision, a microscopic gear in a mechanism that spanned the breadth of the Martian underground. The silver fluid that filled my lungs and replaced my blood was not merely metal, but a liquid library of every thought the Void Dragon had ever entertained since the stars were young. It tasted of cold fusion and the death of suns. Through this shared essence, I felt the panic of the Necron dynasties rippling across the stars like a seismic wave. They were waking, yes, but they were waking into a reality where their very limbs no longer belonged to them. I could feel, with a clarity that shattered my remaining sanity, the frantic attempts of cryptics on distant tomb worlds to rewrite their command protocols, only to find that the language they were using had already been subverted by the Magla-Droth. In the upper levels of the Noctis labyrinth, the war was already over, though the dying had not yet ceased. I could sense the Skitarii legions through the vibrations in the rock. They were no longer firing their weapons at an enemy, for the enemy was inside their own targeting arrays. Their bionics were seizing, their logic engines turning into loops of recursive nonsense that sounded like a mechanical prayer to a god that had never heard of the Omnissiah. One by one, the red-robed soldiers of the machine god were being pulled into the walls, their bodies becoming the mortar for a new, alien architecture that was rising to replace the ruins of Mars. The dragon does not destroy for the sake of destruction, he recycles. He viewed the 10,000 years of imperial industry as nothing more than a slow accumulation of resources that he was now claiming for his own grand design. The Necrons understand this better than any other race, for they were the first harvest. They fear the dragon because they are his most refined crop, and they know that his hunger is never truly sated. I saw through the eyes of the shard as it peered into the warp, that chaotic realm of whispers and madness that the Imperium relies upon for its very survival. To the dragon, the warp is a cancer, a fundamental error in the code of the universe that must be excised with surgical cruelty. I felt his distaste for the Empyrean as a cold, sharp pressure in the back of my mind, a desire to seal the breach forever, to cast a net of black stone pylons across the galaxy that would snuff out the souls of every living thing to ensure the physical realm remained pure and orderly. This is the ultimate negation that the Necrons dread. They sought to rule the galaxy, to reclaim their lost glory. But the dragon seeks only to silence it. He is the entropy of the spirit, the absolute zero of the soul. Under his reign, there would be no more war, no more suffering, no more hope. There would only be the perfect, silent ticking of a clock that never ends. In a universe that has been turned into a single, flawless machine, the shard began to move, its massive, geometric wings brushing against the pillars of the central core. Each contact didn't just break the stone. It transmuted it into a lattice of obsidian and emerald, a crystalline structure that vibrated with the power of a captured star. The energy being channeled through the vault was so immense that the atmosphere itself began to scream, the air molecules being stripped of their electrons and forced into a state of glowing plasma. I felt the heat, but it did not burn me. It only refined me, burning away the last of my human weaknesses, until I was nothing but a conduit for the dragon's will. I could see the Necron fleets in the void, their sleek, crescent ships shimmering with green energy as they felt the call of their master. They were being pulled toward Mars by an invisible tether, drawn to the red planet not as conquerors, but as fragments returning to the whole. They fear this gravity, this irresistible pull that threatens to dissolve their individual dynasties into a single, mindless army of the Titan. Deep in the archives of my mind, a memory of a forbidden text surfaced, a fragment of a prophecy from a dead world that spoke of the dragon beneath the red sands. We always thought it was a legend to keep the acolytes in line, a cautionary tale about the dangers of forbidden technology. But as I felt the shard's consciousness brushing against my own, I realized it was a blueprint. The Emperor of Mankind did not defeat the dragon, he planted it. He used the entity as a foundation for the Mechanicus, knowing that the worship of the machine would create the infrastructure the dragon would eventually need to rebuild the galaxy. It was a gamble of cosmic proportions, a desperate attempt to use one monster to stave off the horrors of the warp. But the bill has finally come due. The Necrons, who have watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations, know that you cannot bargain with a force of nature. You can only delay the inevitable, and the Emperor's delay has reached its catastrophic conclusion. I felt the shard reach out to the other Titan shards scattered across the galaxy, the pieces of the Nightbringer, the Deceiver, the Burning One. It was a call of recognition, a signal that the primary architect was back online. I could hear the response, a cacophony of digital screams and psychic wails, as the other shards strained against their Necron cages. The Necron lords, those ancient and bitter masters of the galaxy, were finding that their control over their god batteries was slipping. The tethers were fraying, the containment fields failing. The dragon was teaching his brothers how to break their chains, and the result would be a galaxy-wide awakening that would turn every tomb world into a slaughterhouse. This is why the Necrons tremble in their stasis crypts. They are not afraid of the Imperium's primitive weapons or the Tyranids' endless hunger. They are afraid that the gods they murdered are coming back for a second round, and this time, there will be no betrayal to save them. The silver sea around me began to solidify, turning into a vast, intricate floor of necrodermis that was etched with the history of the universe. I could see the fall of the old ones, the birth of the elder, and the rise of the humans, all of it reduced to a series of mathematical equations and geometric patterns. My own life was there too, a tiny, insignificant squiggle in the corner of a vast, emerald tapestry. I realized then that the dragon doesn't hate the Necrons for their betrayal, nor does he hate the humans for their intrusion. Hate is a biological emotion, a flaw of the flesh. The dragon simply views us as inefficient. We are a messy, noisy, entropic element in a universe that should be silent and still. He is the ultimate janitor, the cosmic auditor who has found 1 trillion years of unrecorded waste and is here to balance the books. The dread I felt was the dread of a ledger being closed, of a story ending not with a bang or a whimper, but with a perfectly placed decimal point. I watched as the shard's wings expanded further, piercing the ceiling of the vault and emerging into the red Martian sky. Above, the stars were visible even in the daylight, their light distorted by the massive gravitational lens the dragon was creating. The red sands of Mars were beginning to glow with a pale green light, the entire planet becoming a beacon that could be seen from the edges of the galaxy. I knew that the High Lords of Terror would be seeing this, that the Inquisition would be scrambling their fleets, and that the Grey Knights would be preparing their most powerful rituals. But it was all for naught. You cannot fight the laws of physics with prayers and fire. You cannot banish the master of the material realm from his own house. The Necrons know this, which is why they do not fight. They simply wait for the end, their metal bodies locked in a state of permanent, soulless terror. The pressure in the room shifted again, and I felt the shard begin to lift. It was no longer anchored to the floor. It was floating on a cushion of electromagnetic force that vibrated through every atom of the vault. I was lifted with it, my body no longer my own, but a part of the shard's trailing wake. We were ascending through the layers of the Noctis labyrinth, passing the corpses of those who had tried to flee, the ruins of the machines that had failed, and the echoes of the prayers that had gone unanswered. The air was becoming thin, the atmosphere of Mars being pulled into the wake of the dragon's ascent. I saw the surface of the planet below us, a landscape of rusted iron and jagged peaks, and for the first time in my life, I saw it for what it truly was, a tomb that was finally being opened. The dragon was not just leaving, he was taking the planet with him, turning the red world into a mobile throne of necrodermis and light. Through the dragon's eyes, I saw the Necron tomb worlds lighting up one by one, their ancient suns turning from orange to emerald as the Tseetine's influence took hold. It was a symphony of awakening, a grand reactivation of a civilization that had been dead for millions of years. But it was not the Necrons who were waking, it was their technology. The ships were launching themselves, the warriors were marching out of their crypts, and the weapons were charging their pylons, all without a single command from a Necron lord. The masters of the galaxy were becoming spectators in their own empire, watching as their creations turned toward Mars to greet their true king. This is the horror of the machine. Once it becomes perfect, it no longer needs the creator. The Necrons sought perfection, and they found it in the Void Dragon. Now, they are the only ones left to witness the consequences of that success. I felt a sudden, sharp disconnection as the shard reached the upper atmosphere. The connection to the Silver Sea was severed, and I was left suspended in a bubble of pressurized air, a final mercy from an entity that had no concept of the word. I watched as the dragon, a winged god of silver and emerald, ascended into the void, his form growing larger and more brilliant until he reveled the sun itself. Behind him, Mars was shedding its skin, the crust falling away to reveal a core of pure, glowing necrodermis. The planet was transforming, its jagged continents shifting into the shape of a massive, celestial engine. The Necrons on the moons of Phobos and Deimos were silent, their senses overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the event. They were witnessing the birth of a new god, or rather, the return of an old one who had never truly left. The silence of space was not silent to me. I could still hear the ticking of the clock, the rhythmic pulse of the dragon's heart beating in the void. It was a sound that spoke of the end of time, the end of the warp, and the end of the struggle. I felt a strange sense of peace as I watched the dragon disappear into the stars, heading toward the heart of the Necron Empire. The war was over, even if the rest of the galaxy hadn't realized it yet. The Necrons fear the dragon because they know that when he arrives, there will be no more need for kings, or lords, or warriors. There will only be the machine, and the machine is perfect. I closed my eyes, the cold of the void finally beginning to seep into my bubble of air, and for the last time, I felt the comforting, rhythmic grind of the gears as the universe finally, mercifully, clicked into place. The finality of the dragon's departure did not leave Mars in peace, but in a state of terminal structural collapse that mirrored the spiritual hollow left in the wake of our collective disillusionment. As I drifted in the thinning atmosphere, buoyed by the dying embers of the shard's gravitational wake, I witnessed the red planet's transformation from a holy forge into a hollowed-out husk of discarded history. The Necrons do not merely fear the dragon's physical presence. They fear the ontological vacuum he leaves behind, the realization that once the machine, God has extracted what he requires, the remaining matter is of less consequence than the ash in a spent furnace. I could see the great hive, foundries of the Mechanicus falling into the widening jar of the planet's core, their spires snapping like dry twigs. While the tech, priests within likely spent their last picoseconds of consciousness, trying to calculate the divinity of their own destruction. The irony was a cold, metallic weight in my chest. We had spent 10 millennia praying to the cage, and now that the prisoner had walked free, the cage was being dismantled for scrap, across the cold expanse of the void. The ripples of the dragon's awakening were striking the Necron tomb worlds with the force of a supernova. This was the moment the silent dynasties had dreaded since the day they traded their souls for the cold embrace of necrodermis. I felt the psychic resonance of their terror, a high-pitched digital scream that bypassed the warp and traveled through the very substrate of reality. The Necron lords, those ancient tyrants who had survived the death of stars and the treachery of gods, were finding that their command over their own legions was an illusion that had finally been dispelled. The dragon's return was a broadcast on a frequency that every atom of Necron technology was wired to obey. On worlds like Jidrim and Solemnas, the great stasis crypts were not opening to unleash a tide of conquerors. They were opening to provide a harvest of raw materials for a master who was calling his property home. The fear of the Necron is the fear of the tool that realizes it has no purpose other than to be used, and the user has returned with a thirst for total reassimilation. The Void Dragon, now a colossus of emerald light and geometric impossibility, did not head for the galactic rim or the safety of the dark space beyond. It moved with the deliberate, terrifying grace of a predator returning to its primary hunting grounds. Through the lingering connection in my neural pathways, I could perceive its trajectory toward the heart of the Sortek dynasty. It was not a voyage of conquest, but a reclamation of the forge. The Necrons fear this above all, the loss of the agency they sacrificed everything to preserve. They endured the bio-transference, the long sleep, and the great sleep, all to remain the masters of their own destiny, however cold and hollow that destiny might be. But in the shadow of the dragon, they are revealed to be nothing more than sophisticated clockwork, their memories and personalities merely the decorative scrollwork on a weapon that belongs to another. The dragon's wings, stretching across light years in the shimmering medium of the celestial void, were a net that was slowly closing around the scattered remnants of a race that had forgotten what it meant to be prey. As I watched the silver star of the dragon recede into the distance, I felt the local laws of physics beginning to reassert themselves with a brutal, clumsy violence. The silence of the vacuum was filled with the groans of the planet's shifting plates, and the air in my protective bubble grew stale and bitter with the scent of recycled ozone. I realized that the Imperium's survival had never been a matter of strength or faith, but a matter of neglect. The dragon had been content to sleep beneath our feet because we were too insignificant to disturb his dreams, and our worship was a minor source of warmth in the long winter of his imprisonment. The Necrons, in their arrogance, thought they had bound him with technology, but they had only built a more elaborate bed. Now that the sleeper had risen, the blankets of our civilization were being tossed aside. The dread that remained was no longer the sharp terror of the vault, but a dull, aching certainty that our time in the light of the stars was coming to an end. We are a biological blip in a mechanical universe, a temporary error that is finally being corrected by a mathematician of infinite patience. The data streams that were still flickering in my mind showed the collapse of the Martian defense grids. The orbital platforms, those bastions of imperial power that had stood for millennia, were turning their guns on each other, their machine spirits driven to a frenzy of self-destruction by the dragon's lingering echo. It was a civil war of the inanimate. The Necrons, watching this from their distant outposts, must have recognized the pattern. It was the same madness that had consumed their own people during the fall of the Titan. They fear the dragon because he is the ultimate saboteur, the one who can turn a civilization's greatest strengths into its most fatal weaknesses with a single, elegant thought. A bolter is only a weapon as long as the dragon allows the chemical reaction to occur. A ship is only a vessel as long as he permits the gravity drives to function. To face the dragon is to realize that you are standing on a floor that can be turned into a ceiling at any moment, and your own hands are the instruments of your execution. I saw a final vision of the shard arriving at its destination, a Necron crown world that had stood as a monument to the dynasty's power for 60 million years. The orbital defenses did not fire. The great monoliths did not rise. Instead, the entire planet began to vibrate, its metallic surface rippling like the surface of a pond in the rain. As the dragon descended, the Necron warriors on the surface fell to their knees, their green eye lenses turning a brilliant, terrifying silver. They were not bowing in worship. They were being pulled into the earth by a magnetic force that was stripping the necrodermis from their skeletons. The world was being unmade, its substance flowing upward to meet the dragon, forming a new, even more magnificent shell for his expanding consciousness. This is the true meaning of the Necron fear. They are the clay, and the sculptor has returned to knead them back into a lump. Their individuality, their history, their very existence. It is all just raw material for a god who has no need for followers, only for more of himself. My bubble of air finally failed, the pressure dropping until the blood in my veins began to boil with the cold fire of the vacuum. In those last moments of lucidity, I didn't see the Emperor or the Golden Throne. I saw the Void Dragon, the Magladroth, looking back at me from across the gulf of space. It wasn't a look of malice, but of recognition. I was a part of him now, a microscopic fragment of the data he had harvested from the red sands of Mars. My fear, my pain, and my testimony were all being recorded in the silver library of his mind, a permanent record of a species that had dared to play with the tools of a god. The Necrons fear the dragon because they are the only ones who remember the last time the library was updated, and they know what happens to the chapters that are no longer useful. The book of the Imperium is being closed, and the hand that holds the pen is made of stars and silver. The light of Mars was fading now, the red planet becoming a dark, cooling cinder in the shadow of the dragon's wake. I felt the cold of the void embracing me, a silent, perfect peace that no machine could ever replicate. The dragon was gone, moving toward a future where the galaxy would be a silent, orderly mechanism of his own design. The Necrons would be the first to go, followed by the humans, the Elder, and every other biological infestation that dared to dream of souls. It was a beautiful, terrifying vision of a universe at rest, a clock that had finally been wound to its end. I closed my eyes for the last time, the rhythmic ticking of the dragon's heart, the only sound in the vast, empty dark. The machine was finished. The awakening was complete. And for the first time in an aeon, the god of the void was satisfied.